The purpose of this presentation is to review 10 key issues from the required readings on global health governance. We're taking a step back now and not looking at migrant issues specifically, but global health governance overall. And for this, I asked you to read 4 articles: Queen Bee in a Beehive, Architecture Amidst Anarchy, The Multiple Meanings of Global Health Governance, and Gridlock, Innovation and Resilience in Global Health Governance. They each take a slightly different take, but what I think is interesting is they build on each other and you see some themes throughout. They all start with the issue of what is global governance. And they first talk about, particularly the Kelly article, talks about what governance is. Governance is needed when a collective of individuals comes together to accomplish an agreed end. When we talk about governance at the national level, we talk about recognized authority, agreed rules for decision making, and accountability. Then we move to global governance. Global governance is special because it implies governing without sovereign authority and involves relationships that transcend national borders. Global governance is not the same as global government, which refers to a very specific mechanism. It involves non-state actors. It needs to manage the externalities around increased transboundary flows. So, for instance, the global financial crisis of 2008 would be an example of an externality that required global governance to adapt to that. When we talk about global governance in general, you can think of things like the Sustainable Development Goals. That requires a global governance mechanisms. In this case, it's the UN for the most part, but also trade and any regulation of the global commons like oceans or issues like that would require some level of global governance. To discuss global governance, Kelly makes an interesting point on page 3 of the article entitled The Multiple Meanings of Global Health Governance. The authors talk about what is meant by governance without government. These are efforts to bring more orderly and reliable responses to social and political issues that go beyond the capacities of states to address individually. Like the NGO universe, global governance implies an absence of central authority and the need for collaboration or cooperation among governments and others who seek to encourage common practices and goals in addressing global issues. So that's the overall context of global governance. Then what is global health? Global health is a shift to thinking about the health needs of people of the whole planet above those or the concerns of particular nations. Global health problems are problems that require collective action. They're considered transboundary problems. They're problems that have transboundary causes or determinants. And we often, the articles make the distinction between global health describing a health problem versus advocating for a health goal. So they discuss what constitutes a global health problem. For instance, guinea worm would not necessarily be considered a global health problem because it is caused by a vector that's only found in a very few places. Whereas HIV or COVID-19, the current coronavirus, which is spread from people to people who can be everywhere or anywhere, would be more considered global health problems. But in both these cases, for global governance and for global health, the point is raised that the definitions are quite subjective and there are very different definitions of these terms, which makes understanding them and analyzing them even more challenging. The articles talk about 3 concepts of global health governance. The first is globalization and health governance. This refers to it aligns with the architecture metaphor that one of the articles talks about quite specifically. It refers to health-related institutions that govern collective responses. So the World Health Organization, for instance, or an international global health-related NGO. But it really talks about how the health institutions need to be more global in their outlook. The second concept is global governance and health. This would refer more to how more general global governance structures influence health or incorporate health problems. So the examples were given like the Structural Adjustment Program of the World Bank, which isn't essentially about health, but it very much affects global health because it determined how much funding could be going to health, both at the national and international level. Or the trade agreements, which would influence the behavior of pharmaceutical companies, would be an instance of global governance mechanisms that are not specifically health related having an influence on global health problems. Then the third concept is governance for global health. This refers to governance structures that are needed to further global health goals. The example is given of the proposed Framework Convention on Global Health, which doesn't yet exist. Or you could think about the governance structures that are being built up around the Sustainable Development Goals, as I mentioned earlier. Now, one of the articles, the one by the one by Fiedler, really gets into architectural metaphors or metaphors for global health governance. The first one is governance as architecture. So he's saying that when we think of global governance, we think of institutions, so more the globalization and health governance model that I just went over. So governance means there's a set design and some sort of centralized decision making that governs a system or a problem or an issue, whether it's a health issue or some other issue. This he talks about as being difficult enough when we were talking about just states, and he talks about unstructured plurality as being, causing a sort of anarchy, or if you had in the unstructured plurality is that you have many different actors affecting a problem, which makes having a central point of architecture quite difficult. Then he gets into the dynamics of anarchy. So he has a metaphor first for governance as architecture. Then he talks about unstructured plurality. Then he goes into the concept of anarchy. The old school anarchy referred to when states would resist coordination. So they appear to want coordination, but really they're watching out for their own interests. So they resist any kind of strict or functioning architecture around global problems. Fiedler says that this has become even more problematic or complex with open source anarchy, which implies that states and non-states are operating. And he refers to this as sort of what you see with open source journals versus when you have patent laws and you have to pay to access something, or you can limit who gets to see certain materials or who gets to participate. That we now, with social media and where we are in globalization, we have an open source situation where a plethora of actors can be involved in any issue. And he moves then to a metaphor of an open source code. So think of he uses the example like a software. It's almost like you have for each issue, you would have sort of a software of what works to manage that problem. But everyone or every organization, every interest group that comes to that problem can actually manipulate the software, in many ways improving it, but manipulate it as they go. So no one can, there is no way to regulate who gets to get involved in a problem, or who gets to develop a new technology, or who gets to announce new initiatives on a particular problem. So this is sort of an open source code, and the kind of governance you need for that is not a very specific institution that tries to do command and control, but an institution that can take all the improvements that these various interests and actors make to managing or solving a problem and codify that so that it's available for the greatest number of people. That's what he means by saying that global health governance needs to be looked at like an open source code. But he gets to, at the end of his article, the hardware problem. And he indicates that this open source code is operating at an international or global level, where any interest, any concerned group, any state or non-state actor can be participating in the management or development of solutions for a given problem. But the implementation of those solutions and the sustainability of the solutions is dependent on what the metaphor he uses is the hardware of the computer. And for him, the hardware of the computer in which these open source codes operate are national health systems and national capabilities. And he points to the weakness of these and how the open source code cannot really be effective unless the hardware is strong. The article on gridlock talks about the concept of gridlock that goes across global governance. It's not just for global health governance. His point is that this gridlock theory that has pointed out why global governance overall has not improved is really contradicted by what we see in the global health governance sphere. So there's 4 issues that make that cause gridlock in global governance: increasing multipolarity, which means that there's many different points of power in a system. There's not just one government or institution in charge. That would be similar to the open source anarchy that Fiedler raises, that there's harder, more complex problems, that there's institutional inertia, and there's fragmentation. So institutional inertia in the global health governance would be the limitations, for instance, of WHO. Fragmentation would look at the increased transaction costs of having many different organizations operating, the competition for resources that causes, and the dominance of some actors over others, which skew the system. We might look at donors who pay for what they're interested in, not necessarily for what the actors involved, or the poorer countries in this case, feel is important. Interestingly, Held, who wrote this article, suggests that 2 areas that have really caused gridlock in global governance have caused innovation to happen in global health governance. And he takes 3 issues to illustrate his points: HIV/AIDS, the Ebola crisis, and antimicrobial resistance. And he uses those examples in quite interesting ways. But for multipolarity, he talks about the great range of actors that have arisen dealing with global health problems. But he points to antimicrobial resistance and HIV/AIDS as examples of where these new points of power, whether they were middle-income countries or non-state actors, have caused improvements to happen rather than gridlock. In HIV/AIDS, these other actors really raise the importance of human rights. In antimicrobial resistance, middle-income countries pushed for generics against pharmaceutical defense of patents. And then in fragmentation, He talks about the proliferation of health institutions and the dominant influence of donor interests, but this fragmentation has also helped mainstream global health into more political issues. So the fragmentation has allowed non-health issues to adopt health as being important, has actually raised its visibility. This would an example of this would be seeing health as a security issue, or the new arrangements that have arisen with public-private partnerships, innovative collaborations, and he looks at all three case studies to these. Then he looks at innovation and pathways of change in global health governance. Again, I'll just point out that polycentricity really goes back to the anarchy point that was made in the earlier article. Political leadership, we've been looking at throughout the semester, even from the very first week. Held also talks about how gridlock could happen through basically this hardware problem that Fiedler discusses, that the innovation and the many new actors might cause, or they show up weaknesses at country level, and different interests will, or different actors will all adopt issues they're particularly interested in, and not necessarily strengthen the underlying systems, which is the health system problem that we've talked about. And last is challenges for the World Health Organization. All four articles bring that up. What does it mean for WHO to be a meta-governor of global health? How much reform is necessary, and is WHO able to achieve it with its current structure, operational versus technical versus normative roles, and action networks in times of crisis, for instance, in Ebola and in the current coronavirus. So those are 10 key issues from these articles, and I want you to think about your case studies as you read the articles and think about the 10 points I just reviewed.